Mob Entertainment knocked it out of the park with Poppy Playtime Chapter 3, not only upping the quality of scares and gameplay that can be found in it, but giving us some huge lore drops and really compelling imagery. But I hear you, Rye, the tapes were cool to listen to and we saw some cool stuff, but like, what the hell even happened in Chapter 3? What's the overarching plot of the game going to be? Are we any closer to figuring that out? Well, that's what we're here today to find out. So slices, put on your aprons and let's bake ourselves a theory. First, let's recap what we knew before Chapter 3, because look, the vast majority of you all are FNAF fans, as am I. The mental load of remembering all of the lore and timeline stuff about FNAF really takes it out of you and doesn't leave a lot of room for other games, let alone another mascot horror timeline. I know I myself can barely keep them straight. Not to say they're similar, they're not, but it's a lot of stuff to remember. Luckily, while the timeline of events of Poppy Playtime are still just as shrouded in mystery, they are a little less convoluted. So, in 1930, Playtime Co. was founded by Elliot Ludwig. Yes, his name is pronounced like the YouTuber, not the Koopa. Sometime in the 30s, he got divorced, and sometime in the 60s, there was a tragic death in his family. Nevertheless, Elliot Ludwig kept working on Playtime Co., making it incredibly successful, and in 1950 created the Poppy Playtime doll. During this time, however, he was also conducting experiments on rats, specifically using products and materials made out of poppy flowers to try to alter their life, even trying to bring them back from death. He theorized this was possible due to the historic symbolism surrounding the poppy flower. As far as we're aware, Ludwig only tested on rats, and although his experiments were ultimately unsuccessful, he suggested that larger bodies would be more receptive to these experiments. At some point during this time, he creates the Playcare, a fully indoor on-site orphanage. Way later, the company is falling on hard times, struggling to pay its employees, failing its experiments, and failing to keep them secret. But sometime in the late 80s, a man named Harley Sawyer, also known as the Doctor, proposes the BBI, or Bigger Bodies Initiative, which would turn people into large toys which would solve all of their problems, having free labor, having successful experiments, and being able to silence anybody who found out about them, either by experimenting on them or using your experiments to kill them. It's speculated that at this point, Elliot Ludwig dies, because after all, he seems to genuinely care about the children, and he would have been pushing 80 or 90 by this point. So the speculation goes that the only way the Bigger Bodies Initiative was able to be passed is because Elliot Ludwig wasn't there to stop it. During the early stages of these experiments, possibly the first bigger body was the prototype, hence the name. All we've seen of it is a skeletal hand, but it seems to be incredibly smart and incredibly dangerous. Soon after, the Bigger Body Initiative starts experimenting on children, using the residents of the in-house Playcare as their experiments, and creating the game station to monitor the skills and vitals of the various children. Some notable toys and their functions were Huggy Wuggy, who acted as the guard of the place, Mommy Longlegs, who assisted the children in the game station, Boxy Boo, who would silence employees who learned too much, and as we now know, Catnap, who would use gas to keep the children of the Playcare asleep at night. At some point in the 90s, the living toys rebel against the factory workers and try to escape, but they're ultimately unsuccessful, being still trapped in the factory, and after a long enough time have to begin eating each other. Sometime later, we receive a letter that the employees are actually still there, and we go back to the factory, and Chapter 1 begins. Our player seems to be a former employee of the factory, possibly a higher up. As we go deeper into the factory, we eventually kill Huggy Wuggy, probably, and then free the Poppy Playtime doll. She explains that we can use the train to leave the factory because actually nobody's here anymore and we just have to get out. But as she's helping us, she's captured by Mommy Longlegs and we need that train code, so we eventually kill Mommy Longlegs as well. Once Poppy Playtime realizes that we're actually very capable and able to kill two of the major toys, she changes her plan. And instead letting the train leave, she diverts the train deeper into the factory towards the Playcare. The train then crashes and we pass out. And that's everything we knew about Poppy Playtime before this week. So what did we actually learn from Chapter 3? Well, before it actually came out, there was an ARG in the lead up to it. That ARG actually gave us a lot of information about a former employee of Playtime Co., as well as a child named Theodore Graham Bell. The employee is interesting to learn about in his own right, and could have a full video dedicated onto him. But as far as the overarching plot goes, he's more of a conduit to learn more about the Playtime Co. facility rather than himself. And interestingly enough, this child, Theodore, is much more important to Chapter 3, because as we learn, Theo is actually the child who turns into Catnap. As we learned, Theo was a child at the Playcare who often talked to his imaginary friend, but one day he got instructions from his imaginary friend to sneak out of the Playcare, put on a green-handed grab pack, and try to open a maintenance store. However, in doing so, he either did it wrong or there was a malfunction, because he was severely electrocuted and burned. This accident is likely what later led to them turning him into a toy. After all, the Bigger Bodies Initiative often targeted people who were sick or dying, and would also use it to get rid of troublesome people. So a child trying to open maintenance stores who got severely injured is a perfect fit. Notably, this drawing we got in the ARG seems to suggest that his imaginary friend wasn't imaginary, but was instead the prototype trying to get him to do his bidding. This theory makes further sense when you realize Catnap's relationship to the prototype in Chapter 3. As Catnap, Theo would continue to listen to everything the prototype said, and even even begin to worship him as a god. This idolatry only increasing after what we now know as the Hour of Joy. A lot of the teasers and trailers of Chapter 3 kept mentioning this Hour of Joy and that the Hour of Joy will save us. I had previously speculated that our character's name was Miena Bajoy because of this Hour of Joy motif and the letters we see at the beginning of Chapter 2. The thinking was that the Hour of Joy was some prophesized event where one of the higher-ups that escaped would come back and free them all, us, Miss Bajoy. But that speculation was actually just totally wrong, because at the end of Chapter 3, we learn what the Hour of Joy actually was, the term that the toys used for their planned uprising. We learned that the toys' plans was to all at once rise up and attack and kill any nearby humans. And on August 8th, 1995, they did that. And while it killed almost everyone in the factory and seemed to free them from the torture and experimentation, it didn't free them from the building. So instead, they just dragged those corpses as deep into the factory as possible and fed off of them for the coming years. But eventually, they ran out and had to start cannibalizing each other. Poppy laments that it was just senseless violence. After all, while it did stop the experiments, it didn't free them, and arguably they're worse off now. Speaking of Poppy, what else do we learn about characters we've already met? And frankly, we don't learn pretty much anything new about Poppy. But we do learn more about Kissy Missy. As we learned in Chapter 2, she seems to be more helpful than harmful and a lot more helpful than Huggy ever was. And we get more information about why in Chapter 3. Not only do we see that she was most likely a child at the playcare, seeing that this scene has her in a playcare bedroom holding a picture of a girl looking very sad, likely looking at what she used to look like before she was a toy. But when we leave the playcare, we're chokeslammed by Kissy until Poppy calls her off. And we learn that Kissy Missy, while terrified of the playcare, seems to have a protector/helper role for Poppy herself. They kind of just seem like friends. And if they retain their memories since before they were a toy, there's a chance they were friends at the playcare. Some more fun information about characters we already know would be the prototype. We get a better look at the pure size of this arm that we keep seeing, and we hear in a tape that it's able to replicate voices in some rudimentary way to talk. We also get some further context on Mommy Longlegs, specifically Mary, the girl she was before she was turned into a toy. She might have been chosen to be turned into a toy because of panic attacks she received from catnap. The caretaker in the playcare noted that she started, oh my god, look at this fur. The caretaker in the playcare noted in a tape that we hear that girl started having horrible nightmares and convulsing panic attacks, talking about some pale beast. That pale beast most likely is what we see catnap as when we're hallucinating, which would explain why she had these nightmares, because the sleeping gas was also hallucinogenic. Speaking of catnap, let's kick off the discussion of new characters with catnap. We've already established that Theo was the child that is turned into catnap, but what else do we know about catnap specifically? Like, what's his deal? Well, we know that catnap's gas is not only a sleeping agent, but a hallucinogenic. It's the reason we see this weird version of Huggy Wuggy in the basement of the playcare. I've been calling him Fucky Wucky. This purple creature is the true form of catnap, but like we talked about earlier, there is this spooky gas version. This misshapen grayscale monster is what he appears like when you're under the effects of his gas, and I've dubbed him catnap.exe. And notably, in the boss fight for catnap, the multiple versions of it you see in the background are just that, hallucinations. But I'm getting ahead of myself. We'll talk about his boss fight later. We talked about catnap, what about the other smiling critters? Well, they were a line of toys announced alongside catnap. We see them in the factory, we see their cartoon, and we see the statues based on them. But the small aggressive versions we actually see alive in the game are likely the other children who were at the playcare. After all, there's a whole lot of them, and they've been locked in the playhouse due to their appetite. Catnap seems to feed dissenters to these children. One, to feed the children and keep them alive, but two, to punish those who go against the prototype. We see this with Dog Day in notably not only the most horrific scene in Poppy Playtime so far, but arguably one of the most horrific things I've seen in a horror game in a long time. Like, yes, I understand that these are toys, but they're like flesh and blood creatures crawling into the open stomach of a chained man, eating him from the inside and puppeting his body after you. If this was real people, this would need to be censored. Later in the school, we actually meet a toy who was hidden from all of the marketing and was a very pleasant surprise, especially because she's one of the coolest toys we've seen so far, Miss Delight. From what we can see in the Hour of Joy footage, there seems to be at least 8 Mrs. Delights that were made to teach the children. However, after the Hour of Joy, seemingly catnap locked them all in the school and kept them in there. Being trapped in there without food led the Mrs. Delights to become very hungry and territorial over the food that is left over. The Mrs. Delight we meet in the game was the one to make her weapon, Barb. And after going stir crazy and hungry, she starts talking to Barb, thinking that Barb can talk back. Eventually, Barb convinces her that she has to eat the other Mrs. Delights to stay alive. And after that, she just becomes fully on insane and violent, as seen in the tape where she says that if Catnap let her see the children, she would kill them all. Which, by the way, that tape, some of the best voice acting in the game because it is terrifying. And finally, we hear from a character named Ollie. We have the least amount of information about him. Now, interestingly, he's known as Ollie, which might not even be a toy name. He also sounds like a very young boy. Anything I could say about this kid would be speculation, because we really know almost nothing about him. But of that speculation, it is most likely that he is a toy, seeing as he's very young and alive in this factory. And if he's a small boy toy, then again, speculation, but the most likely toy that we've already seen that he could be is probably the baby from the Mommy Longlegs family. And like I said, Ollie is a real name that doesn't have to be the name of a toy, but it does follow the E marketing strategy of the company. Poppy, Huggy, Kissy, Mommy, Ollie, etc., etc. So, we've gone over the characters, and we've gone over the history surrounding Chapter 3. What actually happened during Chapter 3? What's the plot here? Well, after the train crash of Chapter 2, while we were unconscious, Catnap found us, and he put us into some kind of crusher, presumably to use us as food for the smiling critters. We escape and meet Ollie, who tells us that we can go deeper to fight the prototype, but we have to get past Catnap first. Catnap, however, likes to hunt his food before he eats it. This then begins the major chunk of Chapter 3. We need to power on the various buildings within the Playcare to divert that power into the gas control management system so that we can move the gas out of the way, get past Catnap, and go to the prototype. But since Catnap is so protective of the prototype, he tries to stop us. But since he loves the hunt, he doesn't just come outright and attack us. Instead, hanging back and letting us encounter the dangers throughout the Playcare. His gas in the orphanage, Miss Delight in the school, the smiling critters in the playhouse, himself in the offices, and finally a one-on-one confrontation when we get out of the Playcare. But once we're out of the Playcare and we're in this one-on-one confrontation, we don't have access to our gas mask, and the gas begins to mess with our mind and make us hallucinate catnap.exe. We protect ourselves with steam until we have enough charge to be able to electrocute him, which then lights the gas from inside of him, burning him to almost death. As he's dying though, the prototype shows up, and he willingly offers himself to become part of the prototype. Notably, there's a bit of tragic irony here. Theodore, as a child, listened to the prototype's instructions, and then with a green hand pack got electrocuted and eventually was turned into a toy. As Catnap, he listens and worships the prototype, but he is still electrocuted by a green grab pack and now is turned into something completely different. After this, we finally divert the gas and begin the descent to the prototype. But as we're going down, Kissy Missy, who started the lift for us, seemingly gets attacked. My guess, by the prototype. Now that the analysis is done, what about speculation for future chapters? What else does Poppy Playtime have in store for us? How long is this game going to go? Logically, I would argue there's only one chapter left, maybe 2 chapters left. Because think about what this factory did. It made toys, sure, but it also experimented on children to turn them into toys. And we've seen the part of the factory where they make toys, the part of the factory where they test out children before they're turned into toys, and the part of the factory where they hold the children before they're turned into toys. The only thing left is the part where they turn children into toys. This is bolstered by the fact that the gas can be diverted to the area we're going to, the gas that's being used in these experiments. However, if there are somehow 2 chapters left of Poppy Playtime to make an even 5, I think Mob Games already teased what the next area is going to be in the posters of the area where the gondola is to get to the Playcare, an amusement park. Sort of a thing to do outside of the orphanage for the orphans. But then in the next chapter, or if there's only 1 chapter left, in the next chapter now, we're off to fight the prototype in the lab. However, there's one problem with that. If our mission here is to destroy the prototype, why does the prototype want us to continue? In Project Playtime, we get a narration directly from the prototype as the monsters, and the prototype tells us,
"The others are hungry. The others are starving. Get up."
just like so many death messages that also encourage us to keep going forward. Not only that, but you could argue that in Chapter 2, we were too prescient and ready to attack the prototype if it attacked us. But in Chapter 3, we are backed down after an explosion on the ground, weakened, and the prototype just leaves us be. Why would the prototype do this? If we do what we're setting out for, we would kill the prototype. Does it want to die? I don't think so, but I think it thinks that this is the perfect trap. Poppy, Kissy, and likely Ollie think that they're helping to kill the prototype by getting us to it so we can kill it. But the prototype is helping them along because it doesn't think that we can kill it, and instead wants to kill us to complete itself. In other words, think about it this way. The toys were made by turning people into toys. The prototype not only hates this process and wants it to stop, but it was learning the whole time. It literally says that it learns something new about the scientists every day. I think the final goal of the prototype is to turn itself back into a human, and we're the perfect lab rat for his experiment. This game is a genuinely incredible showing from Mob Entertainment, and I cannot wait to see where they take the game next. Poppy Playtime Chapter 3 has been sweeping in reviews and sales and is one of the best showings that Mob Entertainment, and honestly mascot horror in general, has given for a long time. I've made my thoughts known on the earlier chapters of this franchise, and they weren't incredibly positive. But then Peak dropped and we have to talk about it. I've already covered the lore and theories of this chapter, so what about the game itself? Well, that's what we're here today to discuss. So slices, put on your aprons, and let's bake ourselves a theory. Before we begin, I should clarify that as objective as I'm trying to be here, at the end of the day, horror is fundamentally subjective, especially in how it's experienced. At this point, I'm rarely scared when I play games. I think the last time a game genuinely scared me, except for Shipwreck 64, was something like Happy's Humble Burger Farm, and that came out more than 2 years ago. All this to say, I'm pretty damn numb to horror games at this point, but I can still appreciate the artistry that goes into crafting a good horror experience. Just because something doesn't scare me personally doesn't mean it's not scary. And furthermore, everything in this video is just my opinion. I don't have a degree on game design or anything in the field. I've got a creative writing degree, that's about it. So if you disagree with any of the points I make in this video, that's entirely valid. Although I do ask that if you do vehemently disagree with me, why not elaborate yourself in the comments? I'd love to see it. Not to just engagement bait you, but I am curious. Now let's actually get into it. The entire franchise of Poppy Playtime has something major that it has to contend with, and it's having monsters that look scary and imposing, yet simultaneously cute and nice enough to be believably a toy that children would want. It's something that a lot of FNAF fan games mess up, I've noticed, where they spend so much time focusing on making a really scary animatronic, they forget to make sure that it would actually be appealing to kids at all. It's a delicate line to balance, and it's a line that makes mascot horror shine when it's done well. If you go too far into the horror, then people don't believe that any kid would ever actually like this thing. But if you don't go far enough in the horror, you risk not being scary. Poppy Playtime has a mixed history with this, admittedly, but we can use chapters 1 and 2 as an example of what to do and what not to do when compared to chapter 3, because chapter 1 treads that line incredibly well. Huggy Wuggy, for as memed as he's become, is genuinely a good design for a kid's toy. It leans on those old monkey toys with the Velcro hands, and it makes sense that the merchandise of this character sells incredibly well. It's just a good toy design. So how do they translate that into horror? Well, they make him huge and give him teeth. That alone already works. A tall, lanky creature is inherently unsettling, but it's not so far removed from the original design. However, Huggy Wuggy's strength comes in his utilization, specifically that you see his full toy form immediately. But once you turn away and turn back, he's gone. Once he's established as a threat, you no longer see him. And then throughout the rest of the chapter, you just get hints that he's there in the background. You only get his full monster form reveal when he is an active threat. And at that point, you can't stand there to appreciate the design, you have to run. And taking this massive creature and forcing him to follow you through such a small confined space only adds to the claustrophobia and horror of this creature. Chapter 1 does a great job in dealing with utilization of a monster like Huggy Wuggy, if admittedly the chapter 1 as a whole is relatively lacking in content. It's like a half hour long. So So how does Chapter 2 compare? Well, admittedly, it's kind of an example of what not to do, in my opinion. I spoke at length about what I think about Chapter 2's horror in a full video, but granted that video is like over a year old and it didn't age terribly well. Not to say the content of it is bad, I still agree with the points I made, but you could just tell that I've gotten a lot better in the past year making videos. I'm nowhere near the level I want to be, but looking back at that, I do cringe. So to spare you from having to watch an old video, let me summarize briefly my point. The monster designs in Chapter 2 are much more believably toys than they are monsters. They go a little bit too far in the other direction. Mommy and the whole crew, PJ Pugapillar, Bunzo, the Mini Wuggies even, they all are incredibly believable toys, but because of that, they all sort of lack that scare factor that Huggy Wuggy has. Now, this isn't terrible on the surface. These creature designs are fine and can work well if utilized properly. I just also don't think that in Chapter 2 they were utilized properly. We got full body shots of all of these creatures immediately. We knew everything about how they looked right away, and because of that, it was harder to be afraid of them. Personally, I believe that if your creature design on the surface of it isn't inherently scary, which admittedly a lot of mascot horror has to sacrifice the fear factor to make it a believable mascot, they become a lot more effective when they aren't fully known. A perfect example of this is FNAF 1. Not to constantly compare Poppy Playtime and FNAF, they're very separate and different games, and I honestly get annoyed when every single mascot horror gets compared to FNAF, but I realize that the vast majority of my community is FNAF fans, so if I use a FNAF game, you'll immediately know what I'm talking about. Anyway, the FNAF 1 animatronics aren't scary. Like, on the face of it, they are not scary. Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, Foxy, and Golden Freddy are not scary designs at all, but they are very scary in FNAF 1 because of the unknown. We never really get a full, clear shot of them. Even when they're on stage, the camera's too close and it's at such an angle that you're not quite sure what they look like. And then throughout most of the renders on the cameras, they're either slightly unseen, far away, too close, somewhat obscured in the dark, or they're posed in a strange way. You never get a great look at them. The FNAF 1 animatronics work so well because they aren't fully known until it's too late. The only time you get a fully, clearly lit shot of the body of an animatronic is when they're actively killing you, so at that point, you can barely tell what's going on. My main problem with the horror of Chapter 2 is that most of the creatures within it are fully visible the entire time they're there. Now, don't get me wrong. You can't have a game where every monster is always hidden until the last moment. It doesn't work that way. Sometimes monsters need to be in your face, but there are still better ways to utilize creatures that aren't on their surface scary. Ways that Chapter 3 does beautifully, but we'll get there when we get there, because the horror isn't the only problem I had with some of the earlier chapters of Poppy Playtime. There really wasn't a lot of cohesion with the horror and the main gameplay of puzzles. Chapter 1 and Chapter 2 kind of felt like you went from puzzle to horror to puzzle to horror, and then the occasional chase sequence therein. You could argue that the chase sequence at the end of Chapter 1 was an attempt at linking horror and puzzle gameplay, but the conveyor belt chase is less of a puzzle and more just confusing to throw off the player. And of course, Chapter 2 had those separate game station minigames where they tried to combine horror and gameplay, but in my opinion, the core gameplay of Poppy Playtime and what makes it stands out are the grab pack power puzzles. They're really satisfying to do, and some of them approach, not quite, but they approach Portal 2 levels for me, and Portal 2 is one of my favorite games. They give me those vibes. But that gameplay in Chapter 1 and 2 is never combined with horror. In fact, more often than not, they're in clean and separated sections of the facility. So my perfect Poppy Playtime would rectify those two issues. Better utilization of horror and better combination of puzzles and horror. So what did Poppy Playtime Chapter 3 do? Exactly that and more. Let's start off right away with monster design. Like we mentioned, Mob Entertainment has a challenge on the surface with Poppy Playtime. The monsters need to be scary to be an effective horror game, but they also need to believably be toys that children would want to buy. And Chapter 3 figured out a way to bridge this gap by utilizing hallucinations and age. The first major monster we directly encounter is the hallucination version of Huggy Wuggy. This thing's great, incredibly thick and long arms, the outstretched fingers, the toothy grin, and the massive eyes. As a monster, this is a great design, but of course, it's not at all a believable toy that a kid would purchase. But in that moment, it doesn't need to be. That entire section Also, by the way, a great section, nails home the fact that we are very clearly experiencing hallucinations. So when the player sees this creature, they're not thrown off and taken aback. There's no whiplash. We're already experiencing horrific hallucinations. This is just another one. On the other hand, Miss Delight showcases how age can play into a creature design. And also, Miss Delight is a masterclass in showing character exposition through character design. In the school area, you can collect notes that give you the full backstory of Miss Delight, that tells you that after the hour of joy, Catnap locked all of the Miss Delights in the school and waited until one was left. The one that was left was the one we meet, the same one who built a weapon, named it Barb, lost her mind, went crazy and started talking to Barb as if it was a real person, and eventually resorted to eating the other Miss Delights to stay alive. The notes are brutal to read and remind me of some of the darkest moments of Cooking Companions, another great game that deals with survival and starvation and cannibalism. The notes are amazing, but technically, I would argue they're not even necessary, because even if you miss a bunch or all of these notes, one look at the environment and Miss Delight herself, and you can piece together what happened. The believable toy model is introduced to us throughout the school, on posters and cardboard cutouts, so we know what Miss Delight is supposed to look like, but then we meet what she turned into, and we see the exposed, toothy mouth, the signs of struggle and fight all across the dress and body of her, and her only friend, a makeshift weapon of school supplies. One look at Miss Delight, and it is very clear that she has had to fight to survive in this school. This creature design works and is in context because the environment and the design itself explains exactly why she works this way. And one step further, the notes explain her gameplay. A lot of people were confused why she was a weeping angel, aka something that only moved when you weren't looking at it. But the notes explain this pretty much directly. When she had to eat the other Miss Delights to survive, Barb, her weapon, herself, her own mind, convinced her that if she laid incredibly still, the others would think she was dead, and that's when she could surprise them. So when she encounters us, she's doing the same tactic. She's waiting and laying completely still to avoid direct confrontation, and when our back is turned, she'll strike. Of course, we don't think she's dead in this moment, but she's crazy, so like it works. So Fucky Wucky over here and Miss Delight are perfect examples of hallucination and age playing into character design. But what happens when you have a toy that is so cute that neither a hallucination or age could make it scary? Well, you get the perfect example of that in the Smiling Critters. These guys are plush toys. They are small and adorable, and no matter how much you beat and bloody them up, they're still pretty cute. That is where utilization comes in. We've seen pictures and statues and cutouts and so much of the Smiling Critters. By the point we get to the Playhouse, we know exactly what the Smiling Critters are supposed to look like. But when we finally come face to face with these Smiling Critters, it's in a dark, cramped, enclosed space where the only light is a flare gun. Our flare gun. Not only that, but their numbers are relentless. We are surrounded, being chased, and trying to be eaten. The sheer volume and speed and unknowability of how many there are make them scary. And quick aside, but a flare gun that is not only our only source of light, but our only way to defend ourselves, and something that takes time to recharge, is such a brilliant idea for a horror game. I'm surprised it took this long for me to see it in one. Regardless, you never get a great look at the Smiling Critters until they kill you. There's too many of them, they're too fast, and it's too dark. You have a good idea of what they look like, but the fear comes from that incessant chase. Not to mention, the only time that they are fully lit up in a time when it's not directly damaging to us is in probably the most horrifying cutscene of the game, but we'll talk about that closer to the end. Finally, the feline of the hour, don't get jealous, Mark, Catnap. Probably the best design in the franchise so far. At first glance, Catnap threads the line of believability and horror the same way that Huggy Wuggy does. Make it giant, that is inherently scary. And that works here, but it isn't nearly the full story for Catnap's design. Catnap, more than any other creature in this game, showcases the overarching theme of this franchise, starvation. Catnap is huge, sure, but he's skinny, lanky. You can see his vertebrae through his plush exterior. One look at Catnap and you are acutely aware of how starving he is, which immediately explains to you the danger that lies with this creature. But even better than that, its feline nature leans into how it's utilized in the game, stalking its prey. At some point in the game, Ollie explains to you that Catnap loves to stalk its prey for a long time before killing. It lives for the hunt. And that's very apparent, but I don't even think Ollie needed to tell us that. This entire game screams that Catnap is around every corner, and you're only alive because Catnap is letting you stay that way. Between the noises we hear in Home Sweet Home and the faces we see around the corner, to even the rooms that we don't see Catnap. The school and the playhouse, ostensibly, we never see Catnap inside of. But when you think about these locations and go through them, you realize that the school and the playhouse are only the way they are directly because of Catnap. He is the one who locked the Mistalites in there, creating the one we know. And he is the one who chains those who work against him in the playhouse, feeding the smiling critters they're in. I've seen some people compare Catnap to Bendy, but in the way that Bendy is barely utilized in the original series, and they'll often say that Catnap should have had a larger role in the chapter because of all the hype around him. But I disagree with that. I think Catnap's presence seeps throughout every crack of this game. No matter where you go in it, Catnap is there and his presence is known. And that is effective utilization. Alright, so we are well over 20 minutes into this video and we haven't even talked about the gameplay yet. So we should do that. The best way I can explain how well linked horror and gameplay are in this game is by using probably my favorite chapter of the game, the school. In my opinion, the school is a blueprint for how a good Poppy Playtime game can be created. When you first enter the school, you're introduced to the environment, the threat is teased at you, and you have time to do the puzzles. There's no threat, there's no time crunch. The player can look around and familiarize themselves with how the puzzles in this section are going to function. Then, about halfway through, when the player finally has their bearings, a threat is introduced. Now they have to continue the puzzles they already know how to do underneath that threat and time crunch. In this case, Missed a Light. Suddenly, instead of just doing puzzles in various maze-like rooms, you have to do these puzzles while navigating and maneuvering around a weeping angel, a creature incredibly suited for this kind of gameplay. The rest of this game mostly follows this blueprint. Home Sweet Home doesn't have any threat in it for the entire runtime, but that's because Home Sweet Home is sort of the setup for the rest of the game. You're using a lot of the mechanics and types of puzzles you're going to for the rest of the chapter, and because of that, Home Sweet Home, while terrifying, doesn't put an active threat in your way. It's already hard enough for a player to get their bearings. Just let them do that on their own time so you can threaten them later on. And then, halfway through the game when the flare gun is introduced, you give the player a huge cave to play around with this flare gun where it's not necessary, but it's clearly tempting to do so and get used to the weapon. And when you get to the playhouse, in a large open room, clearly lit, a smiling critter comes towards you. And a lot of players' first reaction is, ah, pop, and suddenly they know how the mechanic works. No tutorial necessary. That's good game design. Because then after that, you send the onslaught of smiling critters in the cramped space, a section of gameplay that would have been incredibly frustrating had the player not already known how the flare gun works. I'd even argue that part of the reason we go into such a large cave is so that players naturally want to try to light up a huge section of it and find out that they have a limited use of their flare gun and have to wait for it to recharge. I don't know if that was on purpose, probably was, but even if it wasn't, good on you. For this entire chapter, the player is able to figure out what they need to do, and then they do it under threat. Well, for most of this chapter. But before we talk about that, I said that Poppy Playtime Chapter 3 checks two of my biggest boxes and more. What's that and more? Mob Entertainment really pushed the envelope with how explicit you can be in a mascot horror game. Home Sweet Home is dripping with evidence of dead kids. It is a morbid environment to explore, but even more than that, you see this best in the Dog Day cutscene. Right before the last chase sequence of the playhouse, we meet Dog Day, or what's left of him, a chained up prisoner to Catnap, missing his entire lower half. It doubles down on the threat that's already been established in this chapter, and then triples down, because right at the end of the cutscene, the smiling critters come to collect their meal, crawling inside of his open wound and eating out his insides. One of them even crawls through his eye. This, in my opinion, is the kind of horror that is most effective within mascot horror. If this was like a person that we saw chained up, cut in half, and creatures climbed inside of, it would lose effectiveness for, in my opinion, 2 reasons. One, the believability of this scene would go way down, because a person would not survive cut in half and chained up. And when the body falls and begins being puppeted by the creatures that crawled inside of it, if that was a human, it just deteriorates. It doesn't work. It only works because Dog Day is a toy at the end of it. Like, he was a human made into a toy, but ostensibly now he is a toy. So ironically, being a toy makes the scene more believable. But there's another reason I think this is more effective in mascot horror, and that's just the gore. I'm not prudish when it comes to gore. Gore in horror games can be used very effectively, but a scene like this, I think, would just be gratuitous. It would lean more onto like the later Saw movies after James Wan left, when it turned into just gore for gore's sake and not actually like specific horrific scenes. Because the gore is turned down just a little bit by the fact that he's not a real human, this scene is incredibly effective and one of my favorite scenes in a horror game ever. But unfortunately, as good as this game has been so far, it kind of falls apart at the end. I talked a lot about how earlier moments in this game explain a mechanic to the player and then throw the mechanic at them under threat as a good gameplay like loop. And Poppy Playtime Chapter 3 does this brilliantly for like 80% of the runtime, the first 80% of the runtime. But then the counselor's office and the catnap boss fight kind of swing and miss. The counselor's office, in my opinion, just really slows the game down. There's no active threat or sense of urgency for the entire chunk of the chapter. You're just doing puzzles in a somewhat creepy environment. Frankly, the least creepy environment so far. There's one really good scene of Bunzo getting killed by catnap, but I would argue Home Sweet Home does this whole concept a lot better. And sure, this is coming off of the school and the playhouse back to back, so maybe they wanted to give the player a breather here. Well, if you wanted to do that, that should have just been the first half of the counselor's office. Maybe because this is like where catnap is getting more aggressive, the first half could just be the counselor's office, and the second half we have to do the same thing, but avoiding catnap, maybe hiding past him or distracting him with a flare gun or something. Because the entire section is threat-free, it really slows down the pace of the game. It felt like we were building all this momentum and then we crash like 20 minutes before the end of the game. And that momentum never really picks back up, because immediately after this, something that confuses the hell out of me happens. Ollie explains that the main reason we're moving around in the play care is that we need to activate backup generators within the buildings and then reroute their power to the main power at the base of the building so we can power the gas area. And we do this with Home Sweet Home. We turn on the backup generator, we leave, we plug in a cord, and it goes to 50%. And Ollie explains we need to do one more building. So we go to the school, but Miss Delight damages that generator. So okay, got it, that's game. Then we go to the playhouse, and we don't really see a main backup generator, so we can't do it there either. That's why when we get out of the playhouse, Ollie's like, okay, there's really only one building left, we need to go to the counselor's office. And catnap might be in there, but be careful. And then we do the counselor's office, we turn on the generator, we leave, and we plug in the cable. But then it goes to 96%, and you get a key for something called the Sky Dome, something that has never been introduced to us. As far as I'm aware, we are never told what the Sky Dome is, and it's not on the map at the front of the area. So now, in a pitch black giant, this video is long as hell. So now in a giant pitch black environment, the player has to just figure it out with no direction. Now, this key does have the emblem of a lockbox we saw the entire game ago. Right after Home Sweet Home, there's a cutscene where Poppy and Kissy Missy take us up on a lift and show us the place and turn on the power and then leave us be. And in that cutscene, we're going to the Sky Dome. That's, I assume, what this area is. And on the lockbox she opens is the same flower that our key has. So if you can remember what you did like 4 hours ago, you can piece this together. And that lockbox is lit up. But there had to have been a better way to telegraph this. Or even better, this is Mob Entertainment. If you're watching this, first off, thank you so much. Love the game you made. I promise you, this will make your game like 10 times better. Don't do that. Just cut this whole thing out. When you plug in the counselor's office, just have the battery appear. I don't know why we have to plug in the Sky Dome for the extra 4% of power. Or hell, if you're insistent on having us plug in the Sky Dome, have us do it right after the Poppy and Kissy Missy cutscene when we're next to it. Because this section, in every stream I've watched for this game, has every player going, what the hell am I supposed to do now? I thought I plugged this in and go to gas, and now I can't. Not to mention the people like me who plugged it in and went, cool, let's go to gas. And they meet a locked door after a loading zone and are just confused as all hell. Like, luckily, every streamer I've watched has a chat that they can be like, hey, what am I supposed to do here? And then somebody in chat, in a few of the streams, me, was like, hey, for whatever reason, go to that sky place that Kissy Missy and Poppy were at and plug in that cord too, and then you can do that. It's so confusing to me. I don't know why it's here. It just really wipes the momentum that's been being built on top of what happened at the counselor's office, because for a lot of players I've seen, you just wander around in the dark for like 30 minutes, which really kills the mood. And there's one other issue here. The very next thing you do, the catnap boss fight. The boss fight for catnap is really cool and really fun in concept. Conceptually, the idea of using every hand we've collected in this chapter and every mechanic we've done to defend ourselves and attack against catnap is awesome. And in concept, the idea of taking our defenses and slowly stripping them away one by one to use against catnap is awesome. Conceptually, I love this boss fight, but it is not telegraphed to the player in an understandable way. Because even though we're using the gloves and mechanics we've learned up until now, we're doing something we've never done before in this game, using steam to prevent catnap from attacking us. And sure, there's a little like monitor that flashes instructions at us, but it's not very effective. A lot of people I've seen play the game, myself included, walk up and see the monitor say, prepare yourself, catnap is coming, and go, cool, and then not look at the monitor again. But even if you read the full monitor, it doesn't quite explain it in a very understandable way. And explaining it isn't even the issue. Like I've mentioned earlier in this chapter, the best way for your player to know what to do is have them do it without threat in a very easy to understand way, and then have them do it under threat in a slightly harder way. That feels cohesive. Like, I don't know how else it could be done. It's probably too late to patch anything in. Like, maybe in another universe, if catnap was an active threat in the second half of Counselor's Office, maybe at some points in there we could use steam to protect ourselves from him. So at least when you get there and something turns on steam, you know what's going on. Just learning how to beat catnap is not intuitive at all. On replays, now that I know how to defeat catnap, it's a really fun and compelling boss fight, but figuring that out takes like 5 to 6 tries just to know what's going on. And that is compounded by one other issue I have, and that's the RNG with catnap. Don't get me wrong, for a boss fight like catnap, RNG is a necessity. You need the attacks to be random for this to be fun at all. But in gameplay, it seems like the RNG is completely unbounded. Now, like I said, I'm not a game designer, I'm not a programmer, I don't know how these things actually work, but I've seen fights go where catnap attacks like 3 times a minute for the entire fight, and I've seen catnap boss fights where catnap just doesn't attack the player for almost the entire boss fight. And neither of those are a very fun time. It needs to be closer to the middle. But when you consider that a lot of people take 5 to 6 attempts to know what's going on, I've seen a few streams where someone is doing the catnap boss fight, and their first 3 attempts they get swamped and swept by catnap, and on their like 4th attempt, he just doesn't attack except for like twice, and then they won because it was easy that time. And that does not feel good as a player, trust me. The RNG there may be easy to patch. Like I said, I don't know programming or anything, but if you guys at Mob are still watching, before I move on to the conclusion, my 2 biggest requests that, at least in my not a programmer, not a game designer brain, seem like easy things to implement that will make the game a lot more fun for a lot more players. Take out the fucking Sky Dome plug and tighten the bounds for the RNG of catnap. And also, if anyone from the team of Project Playtime is watching this, please add private parties back or create a matchmaking system that you can party up for, because it is like unplayable, right? I love Project Playtime. It is so fun, but it's really hard to get into a match with my friends. Please make it easy. But those 2 requests will make this game so much more enjoyable. And a perfect example of why is my conclusion. Some of you watching this video right now might think that I don't like Poppy Playtime Chapter 3, even though ostensibly the majority of this video is me telling you how much I like the chapter. But I ended the video with what I didn't like. And more often than not, the ending meaning of something is what sticks with you. That's why people always say when giving criticism, it's best to give a compliment sandwich. Something you like, the negative criticisms, and something else that you liked. That way, you're still giving an overall positive message with important criticisms in the middle. And whenever I talked about game design previously on this channel, I did just that because I wanted to make sure it was clear that I liked what I was talking about. But I specifically didn't do it for this because I think it's emblematic of why the issue at the end of Poppy Playtime Chapter 3 is such a big issue. The bad taste that it left in the mouth of a lot of players. Chapter 3 is one of the best mascot horror games I've ever played, and one of the best horror games I've played in a very long time. And that first 80% of the runtime is perfect. But the 20% at the end is so confusing and poorly shown to the player that some of the reception I've seen online is people saying that like, I didn't know what to do for the entire time. And I'm almost certain that they did. They just didn't know what to do at the end, and that took them like an extra hour because of it. I want to make it very clear. I absolutely loved Poppy Playtime Chapter 3. It's just that the majority of my criticisms of the chapter all happen within the last like 45 minutes of the game. But I am genuinely excited to see what we have left in store for the rest of Poppy Playtime, and whatever Mob Entertainment does next. So what did you guys think about Chapter 3? And thanks for hanging out for a non-FNAF video. Don't get me wrong, I love Five Nights at Freddy's, and the majority of content on this channel will always be Five Nights at Freddy's, unless something drastically happens. But it's great for my sanity to talk about other things I'm passionate about. And if you couldn't tell, I'm very passionate about game design and horror. This video is like 40 minutes long, probably. Poppy Playtime Chapter 4 came out, and it was amazing. The darkest tone of the series so far, and frankly, one of the most intense mascot horror games I think I've ever played. Like, we're talking gore, bodies all over the place, incredibly tragic backstories, and even some on-screen deaths that made me tear up a bit, although I wasn't always as attached to characters that ended on screen. So it's not him, it's saying if I want to continue, I gotta kill this random person. Bet I'm not above killing a toy.
So, you do understand. Good.
Bet. Was I supposed to care?
Let's see which
But I'm sure that after playing this game, a good amount of you were a little confused as to what's going on and where the series is heading, or at least what any of this means. And that's what I'm here today to explain. I'll be going over what actually happened over the course of Chapter 4, how we got here in the first place, what major lore reveals there were, and where we're going next in the franchise. So without any further ado, Slices, put on your aprons and let's bake ourselves a theory. So what actually happened? Well, at the end of Chapter 3, we had just redirected the red smoke from the Playcare down into the prison and the rest of the Playtime Co. facility. Kissy Missy sent Poppy and us down into the prison since the control was outside the lift, but on the way down she got attacked off screen. So when we made it to the bottom, Poppy left us to go back up and look for Kissy. We instead proceed to the prison alone. We very soon encounter the doctor over this TV, Dr. Harley Sawyer. He's the man who's behind the creation of the Bigger Bodies initiative, the program Playtime Co. was secretly running to turn people into toys. The initial premise was to make workers that could work forever and need very little sustenance to be alive. But throughout the chapter, we learned that there was another, more important part of this plan. Something I think is eternal life. But that gets into speculation. While in the prison, the doctor sicks his most loyal creation after us, Yarnaby. Even in its creation, it lacked higher cognitive function, but it was always fiercely loyal to the doctor, and he exploited and abused that fact. We avoid Yarnaby with the help of a new ally, Doughy the Dough-Man, who not only helps us get away from Yarnaby, but directly saves us from Pianosaurus, brutally killing him in front of us, but you know, he is saving us. He leads us to Safe Haven. When the prison was initially built, they also built a safe house, a place that they could sleep that was disconnected from the rest of the facility, even having its own defenses and power generator. It was built so that if anything ever went totally wrong, the staff members would have a safe place to hole up in. But since the toys have taken over, the more sane ones have taken refuge in Safe Haven, protecting themselves from the prototype and the doctor. Inside Safe Haven, Poppy and Doughy discuss the next steps they should take, as well as the state of everything in the prison. We learn that the prototype and the doctor are working together, hunting and starving the toys that are down here and experimenting on the ones they can catch, including alive orphans that are somehow still in the laboratory. Poppy says they're asleep, so I assume they're in some kind of cryostasis. After all, it's been several years since they've been trapped down there. Poppy wants to rescue those those orphans, and then once they're safe, blow up the entire facility, burying everything that was involved with the Bigger Bodies initiative to the ground, including all of the toys. Doughy understands and empathizes with that plan, but he thinks that they should save the sentient toys and allow them to escape as well. Regardless, in Safe Haven, their generator is failing, and to access it to fix it, they need something called an Omni Hand. It's sort of a key/battery/master tool that all of the executives used. They believe that the doctor is using an Omni Hand to control the prison facility. So no matter what, if we're going to side with Poppy or Doughy, we still need that Omni Hand. So we go to confront the doctor. On the way, we encounter Yarnaby again, and during a chase sequence, he gets strung up by this chain over a fiery pit and burns to his death, which is a shame because Yarnaby is really cute. We make it further in and eventually find the true nature of Dr. Sawyer. In life, he apparently went too far with the Bigger Bodies initiative, seeking progress over everything else, and being flippant with getting caught. The other executives didn't like how he was running these experiments, but they still needed his knowledge and intellect, so they decided to turn him into a bigger body, or rather, bigger body parts. They split his lungs, intestines, and brain into 3 separate containers, and kept his consciousness alive through that. That way they could continue the experiments, but force him to give them information when they needed it. But during the Hour of Joy, he tricked the warden into giving him his Omni Hand to help him get out. And ever since then, the doctor had been running the prison entirely, connecting himself to the security systems. It's while he was connected to the prison security system that he began working for the prototype, giving him materials for whatever experiments the prototype is doing down there. We're not sure exactly what those experiments are, but we now know what the actual relationship between the prototype and the doctor is. The prototype is frustrated, having trouble finishing the experiments that the humans never could, and the doctor wants to help but is locked in the prison because the prototype doesn't trust him to enter the laboratory. Smartly so by the prototype, as Dr. Harley Sawyer would likely try to take everything over and put the prototype back in a cell. For the record, my guess is that the true goal of these experiments and what the prototype is trying to replicate right now is the scientific creation of human life. Right now, they're able to take somebody and turn them into a toy. My thought is that what their final experiment is going to be is to take a toy and turn it into a person, or take an old person and turn them into a younger person, essentially scientifically creating life. And I think the prototype is trying to figure that out so they can escape the facility and reintegrate into society. Tangent aside, we track down and destroy all the pieces of the doctor. All the while, he tries to manipulate us into not trusting Poppy, letting us know that she was involved in the Hour of Joy, the time where every toy in the facility rebelled and killed all the adult staff workers so they could be free. But they couldn't leave the facility and instead were now alone and starving. They traded one hell for another. After defeating the doctor, we receive the Omni Hand, and we take it back to Safe Haven to repair the generator. While doing so, Ollie warns us that the prototype is outside and about to attack, so Doughy goes to stall the prototype so we can repair the generator. We do so before Doughy gets back, and Poppy directs us to go to the foundation of the factory and prepare it to explode. The plan is to fill it with red smoke and line it with explosive charges, so that once the orphans are out, we can light the bombs and explode the entire facility. We do so and leave the foundation, but then we run into Doughy, who's still in the tunnels. He warns us that he'd lost track of the prototype, and it's in that moment that Safe Haven explodes. We rush back to find that the prototype had taken the explosives and moved them to Safe Haven, exploding and killing all of the sentient toys that were living there. This tragedy is too much for Doughy. Throughout the chapter, we've learned a lot about Doughy the Doughman and what person is inside of him, but more accurately, we've learned which people are inside of him. As we learn that Doughy was actually 3 children turned into one toy, namely Jack, the boy who falls in the vat of dough at the beginning of the chapter in that video, Matt, a 15-year-old at the playcare who was supremely kind and many kids looked up to as a leader, and Kevin, a problem child with a mean and aggressive streak who was incredibly agile and strong. Their personalities pretty much merged into one person, but this tragedy pushed Doughy too far and fragmented their psyche into pieces. The result is this monstrosity, with all 3 psyches trying to take over control of the body. We run to try and escape, but this broken Doughy gives chase, and we have to end him to save ourselves. We then meet up with Poppy and Kissy. Poppy doesn't understand what's going on, and is convinced that we betrayed her instead of something going wrong. But before she can yell at us too much, Ollie calls and clears everything up, making the reveal that many fans already speculated, that Ollie is the prototype, and has been pretending to be Ollie to lead us and Poppy along, getting us to do exactly what he wants us to. He tells Poppy that it's time to come home, but she instead runs away, abandoning the player and Kissy to die in this trap. Kissy tries to save us, but her arm rips, and we fall down an incredible height. Like, we should have died from this fall, but instead we wind up at the laboratory. Yes, it's still going, this chapter's long as hell. We find this green room filled with poppy flowers, the basis for all of these experiments. We then enter through a security checkpoint, where we trigger an alarm, and a recording of Leith Pierre teases that we're doomed, to which we meet the security system, a still alive Huggy Wuggy. The chapter then ends. One of the most commonly collected series of notes in the game are Riley's journals that we get at the very beginning, but some players may have missed that we have met Riley in this chapter, or at least Riley's corpse. The last note of Riley's journal details that she wants to take the key to the train that leads to the prison and hide it so nobody else ever has to go there again. And wouldn't you know, when we find the key to the train, it's hidden in a high up room by a corpse. That's Riley. She's holding onto the key to this day. And can we just talk about how messed up this model is? I wasn't kidding when I said Mob Entertainment locked the hell in for this chapter. We now know that either through the experimentation itself or trauma, some toys have some or all of their cognitive function and other toys don't. The ones that do have cognitive function and remember their lives refer to the ones who don't as rabid. And looking at how they act, rabid is an apt word to use. I mentioned this earlier, but as many people theorized, Ollie is indeed the prototype, who's pretending to be someone else in order to trick us to doing what he wants. And I'll be honest, I'm not going to change history here. I had been so against the theory of Ollie being the prototype. I thought it was too obvious and that it was setting up a double blind, where we would think that Ollie is the prototype, but he actually isn't, and we'd meet the prototype later. But no, I was just wrong. We just all guessed it correctly. We also now know that Poppy not only knew about the Hour of Joy, but was actively involved in the decision to have it happen. Although she thought that they could all escape after the Hour of Joy, whereas the prototype explained after the fact that they still couldn't leave the facility. We also got a huge confirmation as to the identity of Poppy. Many fans speculated that Poppy was Elliot Ludwig's late daughter, and this chapter finally confirmed that fact. In this incredibly hard to get tape, we hear Poppy say this:
"I wish you were here, Dad. I could really use one of your talks right about now. You know what to say. When you were running this place, you always knew what to say."
And the original head of the factory was Elliot Ludwig. But this also, in a way, goes against a very common theory. Well, it forms a sort of a schism around the prototype being Elliot Ludwig. By the time the prototype exists, Poppy is mourning her father and wishing that he were still here, which in a way says that the prototype isn't her father, because if it is, then she could just talk to the prototype. But if that's the case, it's strange how the prototype keeps referring to the both of them, comparing them, saying that they're the same, and telling Poppy to come home, as a father would to his daughter. So maybe Poppy doesn't know the prototype is Elliot Ludwig, or the prototype is just convinced that he is. Or maybe she doesn't see him as a father at all anymore. But even if Poppy doesn't see the prototype as her father, the prototype does see Poppy as a sort of daughter figure. So we'll have to see what's going on in chapter 5, but it's interesting that this chapter gives evidence for and against this theory simultaneously. But speaking of major identities, we got some clarification and context for some of the documents in the ARG in the lead up to chapter 4, specifically those around Dr. Harley Sawyer. We now know that Harley Sawyer was chosen to be in the Young Geniuses program, and Elliot Ludwig admitted he was one of the smartest people he had ever met, but Harley Sawyer was blinded by progress over everything else, letting his ego dictate his decisions. Elliot saw this lack of empathy and thought that kicking him out of the program would be best for Harley's mind, hopefully helping him to make the right decisions later on. But much later, when the facility began the Bigger Bodies initiative, they hired a private investigator to seek out Harley Sawyer and bring him back to the facility. After all, he's incredibly smart. But unfortunately, throughout all that time, the now Dr. Sawyer was just as empatheticless as ever. And a final identity to talk about is the player. I think it's safe to say that the common theory that I also believed, that the fourth destroyed name in chapter 2 is the player, is disproven. After all, we learn that Omni hands are used by the executives, and the Warden, a character we don't get the name of, used an Omni hand, which implies that he was the fourth executive. Now, the Doctor asks for the Omni hand from the Warden during the Hour of Joy, and promises he'll let the Warden escape if he gives it. There is a possibility here that the Doctor held true to his word, and when receiving the Omni hand, helped the Warden to escape and the rest of the employees were killed, which is why years later the Warden, racked with guilt, goes back to the facility to end everything. That is possible, but there's one issue with it. The Doctor doesn't recognize us. He looks at us several times and just lists us as a human, that he's impressed that the Playtime facility had us as an employee, but let us slip under the radar. If we truly were the Warden, wouldn't the Doctor recognize us? The fact that the Doctor doesn't recognize us at all gives credence to the idea that we're not the Warden, or any executive for a matter of fact. But regardless of which one you believe, the Doctor raises a very good point here. Why are we here? Yes, we received a letter, but we are risking our life time after time after time. We could have left at any time. We could have entered the facility and gone, nah, or we could have just not shown up at all. It's more than this letter. Either we are racked with guilt and trying to right the wrongs of our past, or maybe we're trying to save someone. We also got the first and only look at the body of the prototype in this shadow. Up until now, we've only seen this hand, but now we get a hint towards the rest of its body. And these legs and lower body seem to be a spider-like design. But if that is the body of the prototype, what the hell is this hand? My best guess right now is that the prototype has some sort of detachable, remotely controllable hands, much like a grab pack. After all, this entire facility seems obsessed with hand-based technology. So, all of this lore and plot aside, what's coming next for Poppy Playtime? What does this chapter tell us about the future of the series? Well, for one, I think my theory that there'd be 6 chapters of this game is pretty unlikely at this point. After all, most indie horror games do go for a 5-chapter structure, and there's only one major antagonist left. I assumed this chapter was going to be versus Yarnaby, the next chapter would be versus the prototype, and the last one would be versus the Doctor. But we took out not only Yarnaby, but the Doctor in this chapter alone. So all that's left is the prototype. Unless Poppy goes full evil for some reason next chapter, and she becomes the main antagonist of the whole series, I don't see a likelihood for a 6th chapter. But speaking of the final chapter, we have an interesting point here. It seems pretty straightforward right now, that the prototype is doing experiments in the lab and has these frozen children, and we need to go down there, rescue the children, kill the prototype, and explode the factory. This is all really straightforward. So we have one of 2 options here. Either Poppy Playtime isn't trying to be that cryptic, and that is just what's going to happen, or this is setting up for one final twist. What could that twist be, though? I think the most likely scenario is that there aren't orphans anymore. I think by the time we get to the laboratory in chapter 4, the prototype will have run out of his human experiments, which is why he's growing so impatient with the Doctor, and why he's let us down here all along. He wants to use our body to leave, turning himself into our body using the experiments he's been working on. But I think the big twist of all of this is that none of us are going to make it out alive. Once Poppy realizes that there are no orphans anymore, the player, Poppy, and Kissy decide it best that we go down with the ship. There's no point in saving anyone anymore. All we can do is make sure this never happens again. So with us inside, we destroy the factory, burying everything and erasing this knowledge from the world. But that's just my speculation. What did you think of this chapter? Frankly, I think it's my favorite chapter of the series. Mob Entertainment just keeps getting better and better and better with these games. And I appreciate chapter 4 being so intense and dark throughout the whole game. Mascot horror fans have been craving this kind of stuff. There's this bad rep the genre gets that it's too kid-friendly and aimed for children. So Mob Entertainment saw that criticism and said bet, and locked in. Poppy Playtime is here with what might be their best chapter yet, and surprisingly, not their last chapter. But honestly, with all the twists and turns and lore reveals we've gotten, I'm just excited to see where the series goes next. So today we're going to go over exactly what happened in Chapter 5, what lore reveals we got, and where the series might be going in Chapters 6, 7, and beyond. So Slices, put on your aprons and let's bake ourselves a theory. So what actually happened in Chapter 5? It's honestly hard to talk about without going into all of the lore that got revealed, because they're honestly very intertwined. The game respects the player and assumes that if you want to know what's going on, you'll look into the lore yourself. It doesn't really ever hold your hand with that. Because if you don't look at any of the lore or any of the secret notes or anything while you play, honestly some of the stuff seems out of left field. But if you are paying attention to the lore as you find it, not necessarily the really hidden stuff, but the stuff that you can find looking around, not only is most of this game foreshadowed, it's directly explained before it happens. Down to the fact that this poster, which is all over this facility, foreshadows one of the biggest plot twists and reveals of the entire franchise. So let's go over the plot and figure out what happened. We start off right at the end of Chapter 4, where Huggy Wuggy is chasing us deeper into the laboratory, basically the home base for the prototype. We eventually get away and end up in recycling, the area where the smiling friends who did not take well to the brainwashing were thrown in, skinned alive, and their organs and fluids harvested for more experiments. It's a grim chapter, but it's there we meet Giblet, a surprisingly sentient and friendly toy. He explains that if we can find a new grab pack, he might be able to help us defeat the prototype. So we do just that and meet up again with him and his friend Chum, and discuss that while the prototype seems invincible, he was captured and tested on by the scientists for decades at Playtime Co. So surely if they figured out anything that could be used against him, they would have written it down. We just need to find the documentation. And after a little digging, we find out that there is a master copy of all of the information of Playtime Co. stored even further down in the data center. So that's the goal. We get there, we find out the weakness to the prototype, and we kill him. In getting this document, we also find out a few things. The poppy seeds had been utilized in order to create what they call the growth medium, something that can make flesh or living organic material exponentially grow. They do this on plants, they do this on people, they put it into the toys. It's the secret sauce that makes this work. And that growth medium, the perfected version, is the one that the prototype and Poppy are both full of, which is why they seem to not be able to die. They take a lot of damage, they don't eat or drink, yet they're still kicking and seem fine. It's that growth medium, the perfected version. We also find out about something called a negation formula. In essence, a chemical that could neutralize the effects of the growth medium. It's the thing we need to kill the prototype, and that recipe is on those data centers. So we continue further down, and on the way find out that the children are being brainwashed to be more acclimated to becoming a toy. All of these videos being recorded or performed live by Miss Gracie, this children's show nightmare flip of a thing. And it's not the presentation, it's the content.
If any negative Nancy's tell us we can't be toys, then we'll pop their heads off. Let's be soft like Huggy Wuggy, my little sweetie Sam.
And it actually turns out that during the Hour of Joy, when they got their hands on her, they actually turned her into a toy and then forced her to watch her own videos, which is why Lily Lovebraids is so insane. But speaking of Lily, she captures us and offers us up to the prototype, where we finally get the reveal of this monstrosity, and let me tell you, this is an amazing design. I am so happy and impressed with the design of the prototype. Absolutely lived up to it. And I'm very glad I stayed off of Twitter and TikTok Tuesday and Wednesday until I played the game myself, because apparently it literally got spoiled the day before the game came out. Crazy. But it's revealed, as many of us suspected, that the orphans are in fact dead. And in front of us, the prototype seems to almost kill Poppy, possibly kill Poppy, but then there's a scuffle and Kissy scoops up Poppy and the three of us escape, finding out that Poppy did survive this seemingly fatal attack, likely due to her growth medium. We regroup and agree the plan is still to get to the tram to get to the data center. And we finally do, but as we get to the station, the prototype shows up again and kills Huggy Wuggy and Kissy Missy in front of us, leaving us only Giblet, Poppy, and ourselves, to which we hop on the train and eventually use the train to try to attack the prototype, and it does stall him for a moment, but again, he can't be killed normally. So he bursts out and catches up to us, stabbing the player through the chest and kidnapping Poppy once again. And then there's this final cutscene, which, we're looking at it, so many people think we're being dunked into the vat of the Poppy mixture, but I think that's what's happening to Poppy. He said that he will fix her and make her better, saying that she acts like a child because they made her into a child. So the idea that he breaks her and then throws her in the growth serum to grow more makes sense. Not to mention, we get stabbed and fall, and then we wake up to Giblet shocking us in the exact same spot. So I think we just got stabbed and left for dead. How we survived this stab, I have no idea. And frankly, it makes me think the player might already have some of the growth mixture inside of them, and we're going full Ethan Winters, but I don't know, that remains to be seen. But since we are finally at the servers, the player and Giblet go down and access the master backup copy of all the data. And the master copy is apparently the Doctor, who's still alive. And with the implications that we need to ask him for help, the chapter ends. What an insane chapter. And as wordy and long as that summary was, I promise you that is a bare bones skim of what we find out and what happens in chapter 4. Because this chapter seems to be our final rising action, giving us all the information we need to know about our antagonists, how to defeat them, how we're going to find out how we defeat them, who they are, what their motivations are. We got all of that in just chapter 5. So what lore did we learn in this chapter? Frankly, there was so much direct lore that some of it felt almost fan-made. It was too good to be true. And I'll be very honest in saying that as of recording and writing this, I have not found every single note in the game. At least I don't think I did. I did 2 playthroughs, and while neither of them found all 35 notes in one playthrough, I got different notes in each playthrough, so I got most of them. But I did find and listen to every cassette tape, VHS tape, and Lamone. He's there. Although, quick thing, I can't get him past this cutscene. So I'm putting out a bounty. I don't know, 20 bucks, whatever. The first person who can figure out how to get Lamone to the end of the game, record it and let me know. I want to do Lamone % so bad. But the lore reveals in this chapter were insane. This chapter confirms the identity of the prototype and how him and Poppy were created. It confirms the prototype's motivation, and it even nearly confirms the player identity. But before we even get to all of that, it also explains how the Doctor survived chapter 4. A lot of folks are understandably confused that half of chapter 4 was dedicated to killing the Doctor, and then in the next chapter he's not dead. But there are 2 hidden letters to Leith Pierre that sort of just directly explain how this is possible. The first one here is actually the Doctor explaining that he figured out the possible way to duplicate a mind, a way to infinitely test on somebody's brain if you can duplicate their mind. That way you won't worry about running out of test subjects. They decided it best to use that very same technology to copy his mind and keep a backup of it in case anything ever happened. So the Doctor we see in the basement is not the Doctor we killed in chapter 4. It's a copy of him that doesn't even know what the Hour of Joy is. So it'll be interesting to see how he interacts with the player. But speaking of the player, who is the player? It seems more and more likely, especially after chapter 5, that the player character is Richard Lovitz, the guy we've heard about or from in at least one audio tape or VHS tape or whatever in every single chapter. And the main reason is twofold. One, all of the other candidates are kind of doing their own thing. Rich was thought to be one of the main possibilities for the prototype, but now that we definitively know who that is, he can't go there. And 2, the main other possibility for the player was the 5th executive, and now we know exactly who that is. And it all comes down to this audio tape, where Eddie Ritterman and Leith Pierre are trying to figure out what to do about Rich, as even though he's just a warehouse manager, he's become sort of a people's champion. The employees really love and respect him, which means if he ever found out about what was going on and he told the employees, it would be a huge problem. But they can't just fire him because he would become a martyr. People would go on strike for him if they fired him. So the plan was instead to make him an executive, give him a massive promotion, a new car, huge money, basically make it seem like he sold his soul, like he sold out the employees in their best interest to enrich himself, giving up on fighting for his fellow workers in the chase of that bag. Because remember, as workers, collective action is our only bargaining chip. Anything seeking to drive a wedge between workers is simply the upper class trying to push the lower classes down. We are stronger together, there are more of us than there are them. And then once everybody hates Rich for seeming like a sellout, they can fire him without issue. And suddenly, this explains everything about the player character. That's why the player is the 5th executive. It's why the 5th executive's name was hidden from us. It's why there are 5 executive slides, but only 4 executive doors down in the play care. It's why Dr. Harley Sawyer doesn't recognize this 5th executive. It's because it was all a sham. They never actually planned to have Rich be the 5th executive. They only gave him the promotion so they could fire him without issue. This is by far the best explanation for any player character we've gotten so far. We play as Rich, someone who's come to help and stop what's going on, save what children he can, and undo what he unwillingly helped to support. But that's still technically speculation. We didn't get a solid confirmation that the player is rich. So let's move on to something we did get a direct confirmation for. The prototype has been one of the biggest mysteries of Poppy Playtime since we first saw its hand. Something that was maybe the first bigger body experiment, but not technically a bigger body. All we ever saw was this skeletal hand. But the timeline was always a bit confusing about him, and his source and who made him was always murky. Is it Elliot Ludwig? Is it Rich? Is it Leith Pierre? Is it the fifth executive? No one really knew. And we finally have the reveal of who the prototype is. And while I don't think it was the most common theory, this was a heavily speculated character to be the prototype. But I'll let the audio tape speak for itself.
Did you say something? Oliver? If you want to talk, I'm here. I don't pretend to know, but some is... No, Ollie.
It's never about me. Never about my place. It was for her. She's all you talk about.
Oh, my boy.
You don't get to call me that. Call me. I'm a test runner. The prototype.
So, what's happening here? Because that seemed really direct. As we see in the files, the prototype was the predecessor to Poppy. He's experiment 1006, and Poppy is experiment 1007. And both of them were created with the specific mixture that Elliot Ludwig created that makes somebody never die. Now combine that with what we hear in this page in the last room in the game, what Leith Pierre wrote in his journal. Quote, "Where to even begin with this nightmare of a week? They were hiding it down in play care, probably for several weeks, and somehow nobody noticed it. If it weren't for the accident with that Theodore child, I'm not sure we'd have discovered them at all, or Elliot's body. At any rate, Theodore's imaginary friend won't talk to anyone, but the girl, the one Elliot's notes called 1007, is a bit more cooperative. I feel like a moron just writing this part. She introduced herself as Poppy, not the doll, but the girl the dolls were made after, Poppy Ludwig. She remembered me, how we met. She had the same voice and everything. It was made only more unnerving by the fact that she seemed downright traumatized by the whole ordeal. It's impossible, isn't it? The girl's been gone a long time. There's more though. Things my investigator dug up from an office Elliot had tucked away. Most of it is trashed, but there are pieces. I still don't know what to make of it. All I know for sure is something big has been going on under our noses. Whatever it is, I think it might have gotten the old man killed. And a picture starts to form here. But to be clear, let me put it together. When Elliot Ludwig's daughter died, he began working on experimenting with rats and poppy flowers to try to undo death, to revive something that has died, make something unkillable, immortal. Or at least we know that by experiment 814, he was working with gel made out of poppies and rats. And he must have figured it out by experiment 1005, because by 1006, he felt confident enough to try this experiment on a child. Obviously, he couldn't risk his daughter's life. He would have come this far for nothing if his experiment didn't work. He needed to test it. Enter Oliver, an orphan from likely the play care that he could adopt as his own for one sole purpose, an experiment before trying this new method of revival on his own daughter. And it did work. Now, we don't know exactly what he was. He may have just been this sentient, crawlable hand for all we know. But he was sentient, could speak, and had all of the memories of Oliver still. Once this worked, Elliot began working immediately on Poppy, creating Poppy, experiment 1007. And it was in this time that Ollie began to realize that he was only a test run for Elliot Ludwig. That was the point of all of this. And in his frustration in finding out that all he ever was a prototype for Elliot's manipulations and experiments, he lost it. And he killed Elliot Ludwig. And from then on, the prototype and Poppy hid in the play care away from staff, until eventually the prototype's escape attempt failed. Theodore was just supposed to open a door for him, but ended up getting horribly electrocuted, and the prototype gave himself up to save him. That's how the prototype becomes initially captured by the scientists. The scientists didn't create the prototype or Poppy. They were both by Elliot. They were found by the scientists, and the experiments increased and ramped up from then on. That being said though, what's the prototype's goal? Like, what is the point of all this? Why is the prototype ruining the lives of everyone at this factory? What is the purpose? Well, that's spelled out for us pretty plainly in this audio tape. In essence, The prototype and Poppy are the only two successful experiments, the ones that cannot die. Everyone else eventually will. The prototype is terrified of a lonely infinity, being alive forever with no one but Poppy to share it with. And even then, Poppy doesn't seem to want to share it with him. So he needs to figure out immortality so that he's not alone for the rest of his life. Now, he's still very evil, because I get that fear causing you to do terrible things, but as we discussed, a negation formula was already figured out by now. He could just die if he's so afraid of living forever, but he chooses not to. Instead, he causes mass toy genocide in order to hopefully figure out what his father already did. So what's next for the franchise? This game shook up the Poppy Playtime timeline immensely, and I would need a whole separate video to talk about the timeline of Poppy Playtime at this point. But the big question is, now that we know more than ever where we are, when we are, and what's happening next? The way I see it, there's really two possibilities for where the franchise goes on from here, and that's if they want to do just a chapter 6 to end out the series, or if they want to do chapter 6 and 7. Shit. If it's just chapter 6, then it seems pretty straightforward what the ending is going to be. Rich and Giblet, with the assistance and knowledge from the Doctor, are going to finally take on the prototype and the modified new Poppy, being able to take them both down with the negation formula. I also have a feeling Chum is going to show up. We've established that one of the creatures who agreed to help the prototype is secretly on our side, and they seem fine by the end of the chapter. So I wouldn't doubt if that seed was planted, so later down the line, in a key moment, Chum can betray the prototype and help us, but we'll see. However, if there's a chapter 7, then I could see Poppy Playtime going full Portal 2 with this ending. In the process of taking down the prototype, the Doctor tells us that he can take it apart from the inside if we can get his consciousness into that toy somehow. And when we do so, it does work, but now Harley Sawyer controls the body of the prototype, ejects out the prototype's consciousness, and is the new big bad. And we have to work with Poppy and the consciousness of the prototype to take on Harley Sawyer, this monstrous, infinitely evil creature. And I could see it going either way, but the only way to find out for sure is to wait for it to come out. I mean, hell, I thought this was going to be the final chapter, and here we are. And that is my analysis and breakdown of Poppy Playtime Chapter 5. It is one of my favorite, if not the best chapter they've come up with so far. It's close with 3, but I think as a package for the franchise, it's probably the best one. Don't forget that tonight I'm going to be live on Twitch at twitch.tv/RightToastYT doing some speed run and trying to play around with the out of bounds of this chapter to see how far we can really push the game, and as an excuse to keep talking about Poppy Playtime. I'd love to see you there. We have a lot of fun.